So let me begin this book talk today with my colleague and friend Cormac Mac Amhlaigh. He has recently published a book within a prestigious series, Oxford Constitutional Theory, and the book carries the title New Constitutional Horizons Towards a Pluralist Constitutional Theory. Cormac is a professor at the University of Edinburgh. Otherwise, he also holds a degree in law, a PhD in law from the European University Institute. And it is also to that period that this very fine treatise dates back. This book launch today fits very nicely within the framework of the overall event that today's talk is a prelude to. Namely, tomorrow we are going to discuss the future of Europe, and for many, the past, the present, and perhaps also the future of Europe is to be pluralist, whatever pluralism stands for. This book talk today also fits nicely within the overall program of the Jean Monnet Chair on pluralism in EU law that I'm currently holding here at the new university. So Cormac, first of all, congratulations for publishing this book. Before we engage in a dialogue about this book, before we conduct sort of an interview as we agreed, I would like to invite you to present this book in a nutshell, in a couple of sentences. I have inquired with our audience here whether they have already read the book. Most of them haven't. They have heard about this book. They haven't read it. So now you have your 5 minutes to convince them to read the book, to buy the book, and to continue the research in this field. So thank you very much for being with us, even though it's only online, but the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mate, and very many apologies for not being able to join you there in Ljubljana. I was very, very much looking forward to this trip, but last minute circumstances meant I had to cancel. But it's nice to be at least virtually there, if not anywhere near as good as being there in person. But okay, so I have to do a sales pitch of the book in 5 minutes. I didn't realize that was my brief. So what I'll say is just a couple of things to say about the book, I guess. One is that the way that the book is set out, so or where it came from, looking at a lot of the work on constitutional pluralism, of which, of course, your host, Mate, is one of the foremost speakers, I'd say, in the second wave. If we consider Walker, McCormick et al. The first wave, and you kind of spearheaded part of the second wave, Mate. And looking at just different discussions that were going around and feeling that there were some bits missing and there were some bits that required further explanation, and just puzzles I had, and kind of looking into the literature and maybe not finding what I expected, or expecting solutions and not finding them, and then kind of having to just go and do it yourself ultimately in some respects. So that's basically kind of where the book came from. And it sets the context of the book is what it calls the circumstances of constitutional pluralism. This is something that many of you will be familiar with, this idea, which sets the scene or the context within which the book or the arguments are developed, and also explains why we need a constitutional theory, right? And in this respect, it does similar things to the more famous versions of this idea, the circumstances of justice, famously put forward by David Hume and then popularized and made famous by John Rawls, which set the conditions for a theory of justice. Why do we need a theory of justice? In his context, limited altruism and scarcity. Similarly, Jeremy Waldron has done a similar, or co-opted the idea in the context of the circumstances of politics. Why do we need a theory of legitimate decision-making, democratic decision-making, in Waldron's account? And so the book here tries to advance the circumstances of constitutional pluralism, operates in the same way. Why do we need a theory of constitutional pluralism? And the two key features of assumptions I make about the world we live in today. One is that as legal actors, judicial actors, lawyers, academics, we're increasingly faced with a plurality of legal systems, and there's disagreement about which legal system should apply. The paradigmatic case for all of this is, of course, the European Union, but it does apply to other contexts as well. And the other feature of the circumstances of constitutional pluralism is disagreement about which authority claim is valid and or superior, which is a better authority claim. So there are two core types of disagreement that I think call out for some sort of a pluralist constitutional theory. So the book tries to develop this theory in two parts, reflecting what I think to be the two dimensions of constitutional theory. One is legality, the other is legitimacy. Legality in this book, and that reflects the two parts of the book. So the first couple of chapters deal with the question of legality, and the second couple of chapters deal with the question of legitimacy. Here, legality just means the idea of law or a legal system, what a legal system is, um, with key kind of features that we come to understand it in sort of modernist state conceptions of law, source-based, systemic, etc., etc. Um, and under this rubric of legality, each chapter addresses a particular question. First, what kind of models of law are pluralism compliant? So if we do have to theorize legal plurality in this sense, and by legal plurality, I mean a plurality of modernist state types legal systems, which is distinguished from, say, anthropological or sociological approaches to legal pluralism. It then looks at the idea of non-state legal systems, of course, because part of this whole project is to suggest that states aren't the only sites of systemic law, right? There can be other sites, paradigmatically the European Union, but there are other examples too. And it delves into those old questions. I took international law as the kind of paradigm case of this and looked at the different arguments about how to theorize a non-state legal system. And then the third part of legality looks at how to understand how we tell legal systems apart. And this, for me, was one of the most surprising things, I think, in the literature, that there's a lot of discussion about legal pluralism, constitutional pluralism, and this presupposes that we can tell one legal system from another, that we can tell that they're different, right? It's a kind of a counter-monist position a la Kelsen. But there wasn't a lot of work done on, at least in English, right, that I was aware of, that deals with this question of how do we tell legal systems apart? Because a lot of the literature relies on this idea that we can tell, say, national law, national constitutional law from EU law, and we have a criteria to differentiate that. And looking into this question, I found that either the tools we had were inadequate or they didn't explain what was going on. And so I tried to kind of push forward a theory of what we can fancy terms call the individuation of legal systems. It just means how do we know if a norm belongs, say, to the EU legal system or the national constitutional order. So then the second part of the book looks at questions of legitimacy. And here I consider constitutional theory and the idea of constitutionalism here as a normative political theory, right? And that's an important move I make, I think, because there's a lot of confusion around debates in constitutionalism, constitutional theory about whether it's a descriptive theory, whether it's a normative theory, what we mean by that. And so here I suggest that it's best understood as a normative political theory of legitimacy. It's a way of talking about legitimacy of different authorities. And I delve into the different types of legitimacy claims that we can associate with this idea of constitutionalism, and in particular the question of disagreement and how we can theorize disagreement about that concept in terms of its substance, but also in terms of its scope of application. Because, of course, when we talk about a loaded concept like constitutionalism itself, there is that idea that this is associated with states, or it can only be talked about in state contexts. But more recent discourse, of course, is talking about post-state constitutionalism. So I kind of engage um, with those disagreements as well. Um, Very briefly to end where I end up in developing a pluralist conception of constitutional theory, or a theory of constitutional pluralism in terms of how we should resolve disagreements. I focus on the EU context, and I say basically that the orthodox approaches are getting it all wrong because they are either talking past each other or engaged in semantic disagreements. Those Dworkinians amongst you will hear the echoes of Dworkin here. And I use Dworkin and say, look, we should really be thinking of constitutionalism and these disagreements and constitutional conflicts that we're also familiar with in terms of Dworkinian interpretive concepts rather than criterial concepts. And a lot of the problems we've had, I think at least, with this discussion around constitutional conflicts and constitutional pluralism stem from a tendency to address these concepts as criterial concepts. As Dworkin famously said, these are concepts that are yield precise defining conditions, like an equilateral triangle is a famous example. But he argues that there are other concepts, interpretive concepts, which are not usefully viewed in this way, that we should focus on their political value. and understand disagreements about that political value as best interpretations of that political value. So presenting the value, famously in his case, law's integrity, or the concept of law in its best light. So what I try and do is argue that we better understand constitutional conflicts as disagreements about what EU constitutional authority in the EU context, at least, um, represents in its best light. And this is a more fruitful way of addressing this problem than just saying, where is the locus of ultimate authority in the EU, or what does sovereignty really mean, or what is the essence of the primacy of EU law, or any of that. I think that's a criterial approach. It's better and more fruitful to explore it as an interpretive concept. So that is basically my elevator pitch for the book.
Thank you very much, Cormac. You summarized this almost as well as good as a Chat GPT would do it. It's really a good summary. You mentioned all the building blocks of your book. And when I was reading your book, of course, with great interest, as I've also followed your own work, I was thinking how this book differs from other treatises on constitutional pluralism in the field. And it really strikes me that this is probably one of the most rigorous theoretical attempts to engage with the challenges of the circumstances of constitutional pluralism. And in this book, you indeed try to marry a lot of dimensions, both deeply theoretical, going to the classical theories about the concept and the notion of law, trying to individuate legal orders, conceptualizing law in the first place, then taking this to the European Union level and then engaging with transnational law, global administrative law, global law as such. So this is, it is remarkable. At the same time, it is, of course, a lot on the plate. And one might object, it's certain parts, more could be said. But we can say this now. And I was, what I thought was really interesting part of the book, and also for the broader audience, was that you also engage with the question that reads, what do we actually do as theorists? What are theories about, why they're good for, and why opting, if at all, for, as you say somewhere, for an ideal theory. So tell us a little bit more for our audience and for others who will be watching this clip later on. What's your take now on the role of theory as such in a scholarly enterprise and in a scholar's approach to the outside world? Because I found these particular parts of the book extremely interesting.
Okay, well, I was going to respond by thanking you for your kind words, but then you gave me a very difficult question, so I might take back that. So let me address that really big question in this way. So a lot of the criticisms or questions I've had about the book have related to who is the we in this. So when I say we should approach these questions, we should approach these conflicts. And two of the reviews that I've read on the book have said this as well. So this is like a menu or a blueprint for approaching constitutional conflicts, and there's a lot of unpacking of Dworkin's own kind of views on this, right? His the unity of value thesis he has, also this ethical obligation he says we have to try and unify value in this way. And so I'm going to interpret your question as a version of that question that I've had quite a lot. Who is the we in this, and how does this help us in a way? And my answer to that is to say, well, this is part of the way I work. I think I don't know if this is like a universal truth about theory. I mean, we all have kind of bring biographical baggage or our own personalities to our academic work. And something I always think about is in all these contexts is, well, what should we be doing, right? So all these things about solutions and how do we do this and how do we engage and how do we avoid this problem? And I find there's a lot of energy put into this. And I always find myself standing there thinking about let's try and figure out what we should be doing, right? That's really important, I think. And then work at how we might do it and what's feasible and what's not, and what our goals are and that kind of thing. So for me, to orient myself in these kinds of debates, I think this is really important. So what the book is an attempt to try and establish the parameters of what it is we should be doing in one way or another regarding these conflicts, right? And then who does that and who this is relevant to, of course, then can be found out in all sorts of different directions. So the book is aimed, or it engages with the literature on this, so other academics, including your good self, of course, Mate. And that's the starting point. But what I didn't want to suggest, what I think a lot of people have taken from the book, that this is some sort of an elitist, as you say, deeply philosophical project, right, which may not have much practical value and or is somehow is supposed to fly above the heads of people, right? It's supposed to be this, great almost theological exercise. And it's really not. I mean, I think once you start thinking about what it is we should be doing, then we engage with a project of how do we work out who does it and who gets involved. And ultimately, it's everybody, right? Everybody should be trying to understand and engage with these problems in democratic societies, at least, of course, right? And I'm very much a Democrat in that sense. So the ultimate aim is that this is theory, or at least an outline of an approach to a theoretical solution, which should ultimately try and help everybody, or to help everybody, that sounds very grandiose, but at least is of relevance, right, to people who live under authorities, because we all live under these authorities, right? And we all have these questions, they affect us directly, how they impact upon our lives. And so I think it's really important that ultimately, down the line, we all engage. But how we get there is probably another book. I mean, I haven't really done that in the book. It was more a question of, well, let's try and figure out what we should be trying to do before I go on then to say, okay, but then you do this, and different actors have different roles in this, which they probably do. But it's not what I was trying to do in the book. It was more just trying to figure out, okay, what is it we should be doing before we start thinking about who does what and that kind of thing. Um, so, I mean, academics initially, and of course, judicial actors, obviously, to try and help think through these problems. Another point I had, I guess, was trying to think about a little bit this idea of abuses of constitutional pluralism that's come out a lot, and you know, the book is an attempt to try and address real world problems, right? So in that sense, ultimately, it's aimed at trying to address these problems in one way or another. How that translates or in the transmission belt is another thing, but I guess the role of the theory is just to finish up to answer your question is to engage with the real world, right? And theory can help us do that in many different ways. And a lot of the critiques of theory in this respect come from um, and I think an assumption that theory can provide automatic answers, or that, provide simple solutions to complex problems. I don't see that as a role of theory. I think the role of theory is to start on a journey towards resolution of problems. We don't always get it right. It's not always going to be easy, but it's that kind of, we have an agenda set by real world problems and trying to figure out those problems, but it's not going to be instant, right? And if you think theories are going to produce instant answers, then I would disagree with you. I don't think that's the role of theory in this respect.
Right. Thanks. So a theory, I'm sure you would agree, is also a lens through which we peer at what you describe as the real world. And now, when I was reading your book, and this book stands in a way on the shoulders of giants, discussing really the quintessential question of public law, legality and legitimacy. And one might then raise the question, so what is it out there in the real world, empirically speaking, that requires asking this question again? So you mentioned disagreement at the beginning. I think there are still people out there in the scholarly community and elsewhere who would say, well, there's nothing really in the empirical world out there that couldn't be explained by the old monist concepts of the political and legal world, right? So how would you respond to that, to this, let's say, to this descriptive disagreement about the existence of the plurality, before even coming to the normative argument, which is at the end of your book?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I would probably agree that, of course, disagreement's been around for a long time, and um, I'm not trying to suggest there's anything new under the sun in terms of disagreement, and this is some brand new theory. I mean, as you say yourself, it relies on, in some ways, very orthodox theories about law and legal systems. Some relatively old-fashioned in some way. I think maybe the contribution here is to look at that disagreement between systems and between authority claims. And I think there hasn't been a lot of work. So we have a lot of work on disagreement before courts and disagreements within legal systems, within constitutional systems. We have lots of theories of norm conflicts, fundamental rights conflicts, balancing proportionality. All of this, of course, is about disagreement. Disagreements about the concept of law, what it means. That was in part how Dworkin developed his own theory of law. But I suppose my contribution is to say, look, there's also disagreement between systems, and that's something we don't understand very well, right? That it's still the same type of disagreement in a way, and we're still kind of dealing with the same ideas, but it was to shine a light on this kind of between systems disagreement that I felt uh, is really, I think, what constitutional pluralism is trying to build, right? And that's maybe what's new about it in the sense that it's not, was it inter and intra, so inter-systemic disagreement in a way, right? And inter-authority claims disagreement. And that is, I still think, very much a developing area, and there's a lot more to be said on it. It uses some of the old tools, right? Of course it does. But we can operationalize them in trying to better understand disagreement among systems rather than within a political system, of which, we've been around since Plato, Aristotle, and everybody else. But not so much between. And that's really what the circumstances of constitutional pluralism, I think, forces us to address. And that's what the book is trying to contribute to.
We'll continue on the very notion of constitutional pluralism. We also have a very qualified audience in the room, and you're very welcome to raise your question. Just raise your hand, and I will, speak up, and Cormac will hear you. But before you do so, I will abuse my chair a little bit further and rest with the state for a while with the draw of the notion of constitutional pluralism. Cormac, as you are aware, it is not just the notion of constitutional pluralism with the two elements, semantic elements taken together that are contested. Also, constitutionalism as such has been contested, and pluralism even more. So, lay out for us your understanding of these three notions. So how do you understand, especially I think this is a really important contribution to the field of legal theory, the distinction between plurality and pluralism. Maybe if we first start with this, and then I'm going to ask you, so how you would be pluralizing this constitutionalism.
Yeah, so the pluralism distinction I draw from the work of Nicole Rowan. She's in New Zealand, a legal theorist. And also a good friend, but she made this distinction in her famous book Authorities, and it really just tracks that idea that, I think these questions that are thrown up by these constitutional conflicts and by the circumstances of constitutional pluralism, I don't think I need to go into those cases, right? I think we're all reasonably familiar with what I'm talking about here. They do raise different types of questions, excuse me, and so what I said in another presentation is that, like the circumstances of justice or the circumstances of politics, we have the kind of normative contestation around value, which is the second part of the book. But the thing about the circumstances of constitutional pluralism, it sets up also the mechanics of legality. So in the sense that we're still not complete, or still don't have well-developed theories of how to pluralize the idea of legal systems, right? In that sense, in an attempt at a purely descriptive sense, if we understand a legal system to be validity, systematicity, sources, etc., how we understand that in a pluralist sense is still relatively underdeveloped. There's still questions there. So that's why I pull those two things apart. So understanding plurality of legal systems, how do we understand legal systems existing together and interacting in that way, in a way that a lot of the analytical work on this is done, like Neil McCormick's work, also Culver and Julish's work, among others. But then, of course, that the authority claims which track that plurality. I felt it was useful to try and pull them apart, to just put them under the microscope and better understand what the problems were, with a view to trying to better understand them and maybe put forward some solutions. So that's, I didn't want to make a kind of a theological commitment to descriptive theories of law, the question, the extent to which we can understand legal systems without the question of moral, the moral criteria in law, and all of those questions that have kind of been done to death in many ways in analytical jurisprudence. Because I was accused in one session that I was using Dworkin, but Dworkin wouldn't agree with the way I've parsed out legality and legitimacy in the book, right? That one is a purely descriptive account of law, and the other one is a normative inquiry into authority claims. And I think I say in the introduction, I mean, this isn't a commitment to that necessarily worldview of understanding law and authority, but it was just more an analytical question. It was easier to address these. There was so many detailed questions still I felt I wanted to address. And the best way to do that, I felt, was to parse these two things out. And let's look at the idea of a legal system in a kind of classic positivist analytical way and understand how analytical positivist theories manage, or in my case, I think don't manage very well, the question of plurality and on what that means and how we develop that. And then look at the kind of normative questions, because that comes with its own cluster of problems, right? Especially when we talk about transnational authority claims. So yeah, that was kind of what lay behind that distinction and drawing that out, was really to better understand what was going on. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Well, the second question connects to the notion of constitutionalism, of course, right?
Yeah.
You are familiar with the words in the field who are explicitly pluralist, but at the same time they deny the constitutional genre of pluralism, or the pluralist constellation of the world. Like Nico Krisch's work, right, against constitutionalism, in a way. So, to some extent, it seemed to me that your book is not just, this might sound provocative, it's not just a defense of a particular theory of constitutional pluralism, but it's also a defense of the very idea of constitutionalism and its capacity of making sense of the increasingly pluralist and messy world beyond the state. So is this a treatise that wants to, backen up constitutionalism for the 21st century, for the world in which, we've spoken about fragmentation, all these authorities. So is it essentially a defense of constitutionalism?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, yeah, probably it is. As you know, I think Nico Krish is wrong. I attack him towards the end of the book. Um, Partly because, so look, I say, look, constitutionalism, I think, is useful to try and understand these questions. It draws together a cluster of ideas that I think we're disagreeing about. And to that extent, I think it's a useful um, way of approaching these questions. I think partly what a lot of those critiques come from. So those critical constitutionalism is problematic for all these reasons. It's hegemonic, it's imperialist, blah blah blah. Um, I accuse him of being criterial, right? And that's what I think Nico Krish does. He says constitutionalism is terrible. And the reasons are because constitutionalism means X, Y, and Z. And you're like, okay, but people disagree about that, right? So it's kind of pointless to say, well, on my definition, constitutionalism is bad, because then all I have to do is come along and say, well, I got a different definition of constitutionalism, and I think it's great, right? And then you run into that problem that Dworkin talks about. We're talking past each other because we're not really talking about the same thing. Or we suffer from the semantic sting, right? As Dworkin famously put it, right? We're disagreeing about semantics. We're not really disagreeing on substance. So I think it is a defense of constitutionalism, but in a way that avoids those problems, partly because I felt I was very much reacting to the debate, right? So I felt that this debate is kind of pointless and it's kind of going around in circles and it's not getting us anywhere. And these are big issues, and they're issues that are becoming increasingly pressing and issues that we really need to engage with. And so we need to find a better way to approach these problems. And so, in that way, it's a defense of constitutionalism, not because I'm some sort of constitutional fetishist or, I think that, law is a solution to all problems, not at all. It's because I think there is something to those debates that's not being articulated or that's not being made clear, and constitutionalism can help us unearth that. Um, and so I also come from a school. I think radical pluralism and this kind of free for all stuff is a bit too easy. And in a way, this is partly also what Nico Krish and other people have done and say, oh look, it's all fine. Everything just kind of bumps off each other. And I thought, yeah, but what are we disagreeing about then, right? And I think disagreement in the way that I think is useful and fruitful has to be a kind of a rational disagreement about, say, legitimacy claims, right? In a way that we're actually substantively disagreeing about something. I think disagreement can be abused if we don't do that, and we've seen far too much of that lately, right? Oh, I think, that the supremacy of EU law violates the Polish constitution, right? So, and they say, no, but you're wrong. Oh, well, you just disagree, right? We're just disagreeing. This is what liberalism is all about. In some ways, I don't want to say grandiose rescue of liberalism, but this abuse of disagreement for strategic ends, I find really problematic as well. And that's partly my worry with these kind of radical free for all pluralism. It lets people who are not in good faith and who are making strategic moves to cover themselves in the language of disagreement, of political disagreement, of legitimacy in a general sense. And I presented this recently in Graz in Austria, and I came up with this idea of, I mean, I'm not a Habermasian, but the way he talks about the difference between communicative and strategic action, right? If for those of you who know Habermas and know this distinction, for me, disagreement has to be about communicative action, not strategic action. And if we don't tie ourselves down to what is it we're disagreeing about, it's very hard to gauge whether we're acting in good faith. And it's very hard to discriminate between somebody acting strategically or communicatively, right? And so that's why, I had this fundamental concern with getting political disagreement, giving it some substance, giving it some dignity in a way, right? Giving a dignity to political disagreement in a way that allows us to make progress on core normative questions and to exclude disagreement which is not really disagreement. It's purely strategic action. It's purely power moves. It's a form of coercion ultimately. And so that was very important to me, I think, in the context of everything that's going on, right? Particularly in Europe that we're all familiar with. And so with that main concern, I think that's why I had that focus on constitutionalism. We have to have something to disagree about, right? In a substantive, genuine sense.
And
It's
what
not
is
just
that would make a disagreement meaningful?
so that's the solution I put forward in the book is to take this Dworkinian approach, right? And say that, look, ultimately, what we're disagreeing about, and particularly in the constitutional conflicts question, is what presents the authority of EU constitutionalism in its best light, right? So we agree that EU constitutionalism, EU constitutional authority, just to give that example, has political value. We commit to that in our disagreement, right? And then we say, okay, well, I think, EU constitutional authority is best understood as, say, the Court of Justice of the European Union. It's about absolute strict primacy of EU law, right? That's one interpretation. Another would be, no, it's more deference to national authorities. It's more leeway for national authorities to disagree and maybe veer off a very strict legalism in terms of what EU law requires or EU politics the authority requires, provided that we understand ourselves to be agreeing on the idea of the political value of EU constitutionalism, because that requires then people engaged in the disagreement to commit to that core value and unearthing people who are not committed to that. So if you're not committed to that, then we're not engaged in this substantive political disagreement, which is fine. I mean, the world is imperfect, right? But at least then we can say, well, you're not. This isn't a disagreement about legitimacy. This is a disagreement about, well, it's not genuine substantive political disagreement. It's basically coercion.
At the base of constitutional pluralism and meaningful, dignified disagreement, there has to be some monism about the fundamental values, or at least about the context within which the legal order within which disagreement takes place.
Yeah, so people have called this, accused me of being a monist pluralist or a pluralist monist or something like this. I'm comfortable with that. I mean, I think that's fine. I think that's necessary, in fact. That the fact that there is, but it's a very soft monism, right? It's a very soft monism with a core commitment to some basic political value about which we then present our best interpretations, right? Somebody likened it to, it's a little bit like Matthias Kuhm's thesis, but with more place for disagreement, right? So Matthias Kuhn has this very kind of monist, absolute value sense, and it's that idea, but with much more space and scope for disagreement within that, provided that the criteria are or at least the core commitments are there. that we're not just disagreeing because I want to get more money and I just don't want to do what I want and whatever else people have been accused of disagreeing in the EU sense. But it would be a soft, modest form of pluralism. But I think that's the only way we can make sense of political disagreement, right? Otherwise, we're talking past each other. We have to have even Jeremy Waldron, who's a very much kind of liberal pluralist disagreement guy, has this under the root of his theory, this felt need to do things in common, right? That's what he talks about, the circumstances of politics. And there has to be that felt, that commitment, that core commitment to do something in common. Is there even in a very pluralist theory of a political theory like Jeremy Waldron's? And it's really just to emphasize that and bring it out in the context of constitutional pluralism.
Do we have any questions from the audience at this stage? Daniel,
Do I have to go there?
you can scream.
I can scream.
I can hear you, yeah. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Can you see me? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Unfortunately, I haven't read the book. But actually, I'm dealing with the legal theory, so this part with the idea of legal pluralism is quite interesting for me. My question, maybe you have answered it in your book, but my question is, in order to have some idea of legal pluralism, we have to, in my opinion, we have to extend the idea of what law is. So we have to redefine what law is. So usually, the idea of law in this really traditional traditional sense stems from the state law. So we usually name the law, we usually connect to the state law. And state law, of course, has some kind of characteristics. So in order to talk about the legal pluralism, we have to, so what the law is within this idea of legal pluralism. So how do you, from which definition are you coming from? Or do you expand this definition? Because when I was writing some during my PhD, so I was really, for me, it was quite complicated how to, so there are different kind of visions about the legal pluralism. So this is a legal anthropological, social legal perspective, and legal positivistic perspective of what law is. So some anthropologists say that there is some kind of semi-legal autonomous areas. So that's not actually the way how we define, we in sense lawyers or legal theoreticians. So I read one, I was using one quite interesting definition of Brand Tamanaha, like law is what we conventionally label as law. So that's actually the broadest definition. We can start actually from that. So I was wondering what's your conception of law in order to come to this idea of legal pluralism? So that maybe you have answered in the book properly, but so I'm quite curious. Where do you start from in order to come to this idea of legal pluralism, and then at the end constitutional legal pluralism? Thank you.
That's a great question. So I didn't catch the name. What was the name?
David Ivanovic.
David, hi. Thank you for your question. It's a really good question.
Yeah, sorry.
So yeah, it's better if I feel like I'm talking to someone instead of an empty chair. It's a bit strange. That's a really good question. So I have a story about this, and part of the book. So in one of the chapters, I do engage with that literature, the anthropological literature, the sociological literature on legal pluralism, and I make this distinction between legal and constitutional pluralism, which other people have done. Neil Walker has made an attempt, I think, unsatisfactory, but it's okay. We're friends because we disagree with a lot of things. Neil McCormick as well. So the way my version of this story is to say, look, legal pluralism has been around forever, right? There's always been legal pluralism. This is a condition of humanity, right? I think the state was a counter-pluralist project. Part of the development of the state and legal systems was to eradicate this pluralism, centralize authority in one source, right? And that was, you look at, in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, as Gunther Teubner talked about it, this Berkovnia, the idea was the suppression of local laws and local systems to the imperial authority. And that's really what the project of state building was about. So it was an anti-pluralist project. What I'm focusing on in this book is not the kind of legal sociological pluralism, but the idea that this counter-pluralist project of state building produced a new form of law, right? A new form of law that we theorize as analytical jurisprudence, centralized, systemic, validity-based, etc., for all sorts of reasons. But the problem is now, under the circumstances of constitutional pluralism, that form of law itself is now being pluralized. So what we have is lots of different versions of that modernist state conception of law. So that's the kind of pluralism I'm looking at, and I make that very clear in the book, because it's not kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with Fernanda Piri's work, that she does a lot of work, and it's like all the pluralism in law that's ever existed. That's not my project, and I don't have the kind of learning experience to do that. It's deliberately focused, narrowed down to look at a pluralism of modernist state conceptions of law, which don't only apply to states, of course, right? Like the EU is a statist modernist conception of law, at least if we understand it in terms of systematicity, validity, sources, etc., and international law and many other forms of transnational law have this type of pedigree too. So that's the form of, and that's how I would distinguish legal and constitutional pluralism. Constitutional pluralism is a pluralism of the statist type of law, right? Whereas legal pluralism has a much broader lens, a much broader canvas, looking at, Sally Engel Mary, Sally Falk Moore, all these, Brian Tamanaha. I think Tamanaha is wrong about his conception of law, but that's another story. But yeah, so it is very much that idea that this modernist conception has itself been pluralized, and it's trying to engage with that, and it's not trying to do everything about legal pluralism like Fernanda Piri's doing, because I don't have the ability to do that. But thanks for your question.
Thank you.
So this becomes fun. Who wants to get into this chair?
Get into the hot seat.
Lucky will first of all confess I'm Marco.
Hi Marco, how are you? Good to see you.
I start with the common premise that I haven't yet read the book, but I will, because the trailer was attractive. I would like a spoiler after the trailer, and the spoiler is, what is your take on vice? And let me explain you why I'm asking this question. Because I was following, when was it, the Oxford conference, 10 years ago?
More than 10 years ago.
Yeah. So at that time, so 12, 13 years ago, I was really into this debate. And then at a certain point, I got not bored, but I felt that it was didn't have sufficient traction and didn't went to the point that was really behind the issue of constitutional pluralism, which is important. And the sense was, from my perspective, that it was too abstract. And let me be frank in this respect. Hearing your presentation, I think that there is still this element of abstractness that in some way makes the debate difficult to follow. Let me explain why vice, I think, is a good test bench for discussing constitutional pluralism, because as it is commonly presented, the constitutional pluralism looks like a problem of different articulations of the same principles, or different articulations of the principle of proportionality, which is used to accommodate competing principles. And this is also how, at a certain point, also vice was discussed. But the problem in that case is deeper, and it is deeper because it is not a conflict of principle, it is not only a conflict of political and constitutional authority, but it is a conflict of political economies. And
it's a conflict of political what?
Economies.
Economy, yeah.
Competing conceptions of political economy. Or if you want, competing economic regimes. So it is not just a matter of principle, it is a matter of economic doctrines which are institutionalized in a specific institutional arrangement. So the conception of central banking, which is put forward by the Bundesverfassungsgericht, is different from the conception of central banking, which is reinforced by the ECJ. So how does, the question is, how does your approach make a difference in understanding these type of conflicts, which are, as I see them at least, not only conflicts of principles, but conflicts of something which is deeper, conflicts of regimes, conflicts of political economies. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question again. It's a big question. So the first thing I would say is I don't make any claims that this is a handbook how to solve conflicts, right? That's not what it's about. It's trying to recast the debate in a different way, a new approach or a different approach to how we address these questions, right? That's the first thing I would say. Our advice came out, I think, when I was finishing the manuscript, so I don't know if I reference it there, but the way I would interpret your question is say, look, conflicts of views of political economy don't exist in a vacuum, right? Because different political economies, as part of politics, exist all over the world in different ways. The point here is that we're engaged in a conflict of political economy in a given context where there is a kind of common, like this felt need, right, to do something together. That there is this conflict of political economies in a context in which we believe that it's worthwhile to do these things together, right? To organize our political economy somehow in common, yeah? Which is distinct from saying, Finland has a different political economy from the US, right? Because that's a plurality of political economies. Of course, that's true, right? But it's not very interesting. So then I would say this is just down to political disagreement, right? And in the EU context, it would be saying, well, what represents the authority of EU authority in whichever context, in this case of political economy, in its best light, right? And similarly to the Bundesverfassungsgericht's understandings of EU authority in its best light, because of course part of it is about political economy, right? But part of it is also about questions of legality, right? That's what the Bundesverfassung. Well, there's a question of legality here, and there's a question of state consent, and there's a question of ultra vires and institutions stepping beyond their legitimate mandate, their legally prescribed mandate. And so the only way I think to make sense of that, other than saying, look, well, these are different political economies, which is it's true, but it's not, I don't think it gets to the heart of the problem, is to say, well, what is it we're trying to do in common here, right? And how do we best understand our disagreements in trying to do something together? So that would be my answer. I don't think it's not going to spit out an answer to how to resolve disagreements like vice, right? Partly because I think political disagreement is is synchronic the right word? Is that the word I'm looking for? Diachronic. I mean, we can point to one case and say, okay, look, this is what it's really about, but it's really over time, right? That's how politics works. It's not this flashpoint, and this decides the question forever and ever again, and this defines both the conflict and its solution. I think it's over time we understand this better in the way that I'm prescribing. It's probably not a satisfactory answer for what you want to get is how do we resolve questions like vice?
No, I'm not asking how you resolve them, but the problem is how you conceptualize them. Because we are here for doing something together, but the problem is what is the something together? Because on the one hand, it could be seen a political economy which is meant to, for instance, transform and make more competitive social government, and the other is to sustain and expand social government or resist the transformation. So if there is a contrast between the transformation of social government and the resistance to that transformation, we are in a situation in which we are not doing something together. We have a genuine conflict, which spills over in a conflict of authority.
But I would disagree, because I would say all of that conflict is subject to an agreement to be subject to that authority, right? Because politics is complex and it operates at many very different policy fields, and you win in some and you lose in others. And there is a question of I don't like this, but this loser's consent idea, I lose this battle, but I stay in because for me it's worthwhile to be subject to the authority than not, right? And so that idea of politics being, I wouldn't reduce political disagreement to one particular policy area, or it's about the agreement, or at least I would say that it operates in the shadow of agreement of being subject to that authority. Now that's not immutable because you can leave, right? That's what Brexit was about, right? But to the extent to which you agree to be subject to that authority, then the disagreement can be understood as genuine disagreement, but in the shadow of an agreement to be subject to that authority, right? And that's as much as I would say about it, because I don't, that's what genuine political disagreement is about, questions of political economy, among other things, right? So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else wants to come to the chair? Let me then maybe pose the penultimate question, and it relates to what Marco just teased out from your answers. So could we then say, could we rephrase or reformulate your theory as saying that your theory only applies to those circumstances, to those empirical circumstances in which there are actors who have the commitment to do things together, to do things in common? Because if they don't, and I think this is sort of, maybe this is the essence of your definition of constitutionalism. So commitment to common good, doing things having in common and doing things in common. And if that's true, then it leaves out a whole plethora of actors who do not want to have things in common and who do not want to participate in this order of things in the world. And there is something in your book, I like it. I mean, the book was extremely frank. You provokingly are asking your readers, really, this book now at this stage?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because the manuscript was also finished in lockdown when the world seemed to be falling apart, and Trump and Brexit and all of that. Um, so yeah, look, I mean, this is when I go back to my definition of disagreement. And look, I read, radical antagonistic Democrats like Chantal Mouffe and all these people as having the same position in terms of being subject to authority, right? This isn't about just disagreeing for disagreement's sake. It's not about, that for me is the essence of political disagreement. Authority is the essence of political disagreement, right? It emerges when we are agreed to be subject to a common authority, in some sense, to political authority. In the absence of being subject to political authority, then disagreement is not relevant. And this is the point that Jeremy Waldron makes as well. In the circumstances of politics, if we don't have that felt need to do things in common, then we're not disagreeing politically, right? And the whole point of what captures the essence of political agreement is the agreement to be disagreement, sorry, is the agreement to be subject to an authority, and then disagreeing often radically about what that authority should be and how it should go. So it does exclude those who don't feel subject to that authority. Of course, it excludes those who are not buying into that. But I don't think that's a problem, because I don't think you will find any way of making sense of people disagreeing who don't buy into that, right? You can't have a theory of political economy for anarchists, right? Or sorry, political authority for anarchists, right? Because that, by definition, rejects the idea of political authority. I mean, there are limits to what we can do with theory as well, right? And I think that's part of what the book is trying to do. I guess it's a plea for modesty as to what theory can do. And this ties back a little bit into your previous question. It's not a theory of everything and trying to resolve every single disagreement. It's not trying to get every single person on board, because that's impossible. And I, as a Democrat, think it's also problematic, right? People will always disagree, and I will always disagree about authority. But what we can do constructively is understand those engaged in genuine disagreement subject within the agreement being subject to political authority, and try and make sense of those claims, and try and maybe think through solutions to problems that emerge in that context. Because I mean, it's also part of the context, right? A lot of the discussions on constitutional pluralism, as Marco pointed out, it's just talking past each other. I mean, and we're just talking about, okay, we have ultimate authority. No, we have ultimate authority. No, these are our reasons. Well, these are our reasons, right? And it's like, what are we talking about then, right? You say potato, I say potato. Who cares, right? Well, how are we making sense of that? And part of the problems I find with that kind of approach is, look, these are serious issues, and we need better approaches and better methods than just saying, well, I got my definition and you got yours, right? Partly because I think that opens the space for coercion, for power, coercive maneuvers, for strategic action in that Habermasian sense. that we move way beyond a legitimacy discourse, because there is a tacit agreement in this context of political disagreement that we are talking about legitimacy, and we do need to justify our positions, even if, I mean, of course, the world is not perfect. People, are cynical about things and use legitimacy in different ways. But the idea is that at least you can hang people on those claims, right? And you can interrogate people claiming to be democratic, claiming to believe in the rule of law, claiming to believe in subsidiarity, right, in the EU context, claiming to believe in the respect for democratic majorities in member states, because this also works at the EU level as well. And so once we get on board on that as a legitimacy discourse of being subject to political authority, at least we've got traction there. We've got transparency. We can gauge. We can contest. If we buy into it, look, this is just power politics, like people moving back and forth, then it's like, okay, but then we've lost that. And I think that's a big loss, right? At least we capture something when we talk about genuine political disagreement in that way. Just to go back to Marco's practical solution point, I mean, on the question of primacy, part of, I think I'm committed necessarily with this approach to say that, look, primacy can't be a dogma. It can't be something that falls from the sky and has to apply in every single case. It has to engage in and understand that there will be genuine disagreement about what EU authority requires. And that includes whether the primacy of EU law is the best interpretation of EU law, EU authority. Is it that, the best interpretation of how we present this? And I can't commit to the idea that in every case it does, because people will disagree about that, provided that we are all bought into the idea of the political value of EU authority, right? If you don't agree with the political value of EU authority, then we're not engaging in substantive disagreement.
Well, Cormac, thank you. I still have a lot of questions that I could put forward to you. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We have interrogated you a lot. We got a lot of interesting, persuasive questions. There might be pockets of resistance and disagreements, but we will, with the commitment to a common whole or to a single scholarly authority, the best fit, I think we will address this future interactions. I think as I began this talk today, as also Marco and others have noted, this is an extremely rich book. It's a huge enterprise that oscillates from the most abstract meta-theoretical debates about theory, debates about containing and making sense theoretically of the world as such, and then going back to the practical and nitty-gritty details of conflicting ideas of legal as well as economic and political authorities in Europe. It's very interesting. I really thank you for being with us, and I hope that we overlap somewhere soon in practice, in person, and when you get well, of course. Take care, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye, guys, and thank you for your questions.